Good morning. There are a lot of you in this room. It's my pleasure to be here this morning, and actually it's my continued pleasure to be a part of this association. I love the spirit of these gatherings because there's so much diversity in thought and in culture that you can't help but be inspired. And speaking of the spirit, I'm constantly amazed at the power of the human spirit in all of its different forms. And when I say the word spirit, I'm not necessarily talking about anything religious, but I'm talking about the drive that's in each person. What makes each person tick, or how people appear to be inspired to do certain things, or how they exhibit this incredible talent or something inside them that makes them do their own thing and do it well. My daughter, who at 28 years old I still call my little girl, is one of the most creative people I have ever known. Early in her years, I learned the hard way that for her life to have meaning and to have quality, she had to have opportunities to create. At first it was art, drawing particularly, but then she gravitated toward dance. And you know, when your child gets interested in something, you get interested in it. Particularly when they're 6 or 7 years old, because the authorities won't let them drive yet. So you start driving and you don't stop driving until they reach driving age. So all through those years, all the way up until high school graduation, as I watched Jessica and her fellow dancers devote endless hours on school nights and on weekends, it was literally every waking hour of their lives that was not devoted to eating, sleeping, going to school, and doing homework. As I watched them in their rehearsals and in their performances, the only word I can use to describe what happened to me was adoration. Now, I love my daughter, and I do adore her, but that's not the kind of adoration I'm talking about. As I watched those performances and those rehearsals, I was in awe as I watched the creative spirit get unleashed in those children who wanted to make beautiful art through dance. They had concepts and ideas in their heads that they wanted to communicate and convey to viewers through the marriage of the movement of their bodies to beautiful music. And so that experience reminded me, or that collective experience reminded me of something I learned a long time ago as a teacher. And that is that when you have motivated students, whether they are elementary, middle, high school, or university students, when you've got motivated students, you better get out of their way, because there is nothing that will stop them from doing whatever it is that they want to do. They will devote limitless energy to the tasks that they find worthy of their time and investment of energy to get those tasks done, and nothing will stop them. Whether it's going for an athletic championship, or whether it's getting ready for an academic decathlon or a performance of a play at school, or whether it is rolling someone's front yard, they will do what they need to do to get it done. If you are new to the U.S. and you don't know that expression, rolling someone's front yard, ask someone at your table after this is over and they'll tell you. I said later. We're talking about the power of motivation. Well, right now, as we sit here, this is a Friday, this is a school day, there are schools operating all across this country at this very moment, and there are schools that are getting ready to open their doors as we sit here. Did you know that in those classrooms that are open right now, or that will be open in just a matter of minutes, that there are some motivated students? Did you know that? Did you know that there are also some non-motivated students? In my 40-plus years in being in schools, I am sad to say to you that I think there are more students who fall into the non-motivated category than the motivated category. And as I walk the halls of schools at many different levels, I do see motivated learners in some classrooms. But I actually see a whole lot more of what I would call compliant learners. Learners who do what they're told to do, when they're told to do it, and how they're told to do it. I'm sure it doesn't take a rocket scientist among us to figure out that a motivated learner gets a whole lot more out of school than a compliant learner. So if we want all of the efforts that we put into envisioning and planning our lessons and executing those wonderful lessons for our STARTALK students and our teachers, if we want all of that to really bear fruit, we need classrooms full of motivated learners. The good news, we're all here because we are involved in STARTALK student and teacher programs. And that good news is that we experience the happy phenomenon that most of the people who darken our doors are already motivated learners. In student programs, one reason we can come to that conclusion is the fact that these kids could be doing a lot of other things like sleeping late, going to the pool, hanging out with their friends, and yet they come and spend limitless hours with us learning new languages and learning about new cultures. And having spent a large portion of my time in the summer working with STARTALK teacher programs, my experience has been that most teachers come to STARTALK programs highly motivated to improve their skills. So for those of us sitting in this room within our STARTALK hats and context, having motivated learners show up is not the issue. So in a second, I'm going to ask you to turn to the person to your right, and I'm going to ask you to ponder this question. If having motivated learners show up in our classrooms is not the issue, what about motivation is the issue? Talk. So I wonder what some of you said, but I'm going to guess that some of you said that if getting motivated learners is not our issue, then the issue is keeping them motivated. How many of you said that? Well, guess what? You said the right answer. Because that is exactly what our great challenge is. So if motivation then becomes such a huge part of the equation, not only that they come motivated, but how do we keep them motivated, then I think it behooves us to understand a little bit more about what motivation actually is. So I'm turning to a theorist, John Keller, who said, he defined motivation as, that it refers to the choices that people make as to what experiences or goals they will approach or avoid, and the degree of effort that they will make in that respect. So motivation is about putting yourself into something because you really want it, or pulling yourself out of it because it's not delivering what you want. Maybe this little video will really help define it better. about that lonely escalator there at the end that was so popular before the arrival of that darn keyboard. But when that keyboard got there, it motivated those subway patrons to want to do it. They wanted to walk on those keys, and they were willing to exert a lot of extra energy, physical energy, to make that happen. So it is important, I think, for us to kind of get in the head of what the motivated learner is, what's going on in the head of the motivated learner. And what our research tells us, that if a person is motivated, there are 4 principal things that are happening in them simultaneously. The first thing is that they are interested in what they are learning. Let's put it in the classroom context. They're interested in what they are learning. Uh-oh. In many classrooms in this country, we've already got a big problem. Kids are not interested in what's being presented to them. Secondly, they have to find it relevant. Second big uh-oh. It has no relevance to their lives. So the motivated learner has to be interested in what he's learning to do. He has to find that relevant to his life, meaningful to his life. He also has to have what we call a sense of expectancy. And what we mean by that is, I expect I will be successful when I attempt this. And finally, the motivated learner has to have outcomes. So the motivated learner must be interested, must find the work relevant, has to feel a sense of positive movement that he's going to be able to achieve the things that he's working toward, and then he has to have the outcomes in his hand. So the reality is, motivated learners learn more. Motivated learners learn better, and motivated learners have staying power. And we all know, as language teachers, staying power is critical because the language learning journey is a long journey. Probably comes as no surprise to you that the motivated learner is also an empowered learner. So now I want you to turn to the person to your left, and I want you to talk about, what does that term empowered learner mean to you? We have some STARTALK staffers who have microphones who are going to come to you, but I'm going to ask if some of you would raise your hands right now and share with us, what did you say an empowered learner means to you? Can we have some volunteers? Yes, so here we have a microphone, 2 people right here.
We talked about the empowered learner as a rechargeable battery. So the professor or the teacher will recharge the battery, and then the battery should have the power to continue recharging itself beyond that moment.
Very nice, like that analogy, very nice. We have another comment and a microphone in your hand, great.
Empower the students when you, as a teacher, keep their motivation going on, and you engage them and make sure they understand what you're teaching them and they are able to apply it.
Very good. Nice. Another comment right here in the front. This is going to be our last comment.
We said it was more about teaching the students how to learn on their own, so that they can be a lifelong learner on their own.
Excellent. Very nice. So I'm sure that a lot of what you said at your tables was very similar to this, varieties of this, variations on this theme. But the empowered learner is exactly what it says. It's someone who is in charge, who has the power to continue their learning. I think it's important to also think how different they are than that compliant learner that we talked about earlier. The compliant learner is waiting for someone to tell him what to do and how to do it and when to do it. But the empowered learner goes forward with his own battery charged. I don't know if you think about it this way or not, but the empowered learner is all about me. It's all about him. He's actually very selfish. Normally we associate that word negatively, but in this case I think it's really very positive, because that empowered learner wants everybody to support him in his efforts to learn. Dan Scott just said a few minutes ago that these learners are demanding learners. And that's exactly what the empowered learner is. For those of us who don't like empowered learners, we want them to go away because they never stop asking us questions. They never stop asking, but where can I? And so it is a constant source of need. And so this is a positive thing, whereas it might be viewed differently in other situations. So another thing to think about is that empowered learners have requirements. One of the things that they require is something now you already know about, and that is that they have to have these elements of motivation present in them. There has to be that interest, the relevance, the feeling of success, the outcomes in their hand. But in addition to that, empowered learners have to know how well they are doing. It makes sense, right? And anytime you're investing your time and energy into learning something new, you want to know how well you're doing so that you can feel like you're making progress. So I want to propose that we do a little reality check right now. This is going to involve some more conversation with your wonderful table mates. I want you to imagine that we go up to a student. Now remember, the empowered learner has to know how well he's doing. So we go up to a student and we say, in school, how do you usually find out how well you're doing? Or if you want to ask it another way, you might say, how do your teachers find out what you know and can do? At your tables right now, take a few seconds to talk about what do you think a student would say when asked one of those questions. Did any of you say this? How many of you said that students would likely say that word? Raise your hands. You are right. That is exactly what they say in the American context. That's generally how they think they find out what they know and what they can do. So, also at your table right now, again, you know, I'm a big believer in Harry Wong. Do you guys know Harry Wong? He wrote that wonderful book called The First Days of School. And Harry said many wonderful things in that book, but one of the things he said is that the one who's doing the work is the one who's learning. So if you're just sitting listening to me, we don't know what you're learning, but if you're doing all this conversation, you're engaging in this topic. So one more time, maybe two more times, I want you at your tables to ponder this. Come up with a list of words that students would associate with the word tests. So I'm going to ask right now, I'm going to ask for 6 hands to go up who would volunteer to tell us a word at your table that you guys came up with, that students would come up with, associated with the word test. 6 hands in the air, please. Okay. What did you say?
Stress.
Stress. Okay. Who said that? In the back? Stress. All right. Next, Mike.
Waste of time.
Ooh. Mike's just dying over here. Yes, yes.
Pass, fail.
Pass, fail. Okay. Say it, Mike.
Cram.
Cram. Okay. Write it. Another here.
Boring.
Boring. Yes.
Why?
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 Oh, the existential question of the morning. Well, okay, so I'm going to stop you. We could go on and on about this because I'm sure you came up with a long list. I didn't hear anything positive except the word pass. And that doesn't necessarily mean positive. It just means that maybe you made up the first passing grade in the scale. So it's very interesting when you think about tests. I have often asked kids, when you hear the word test, and because a lot of us come back and say, well, my tests have a lot of different components to them. And so there's a performance component in addition to this, that, or the other. And I say, okay, but when we say the word test to kids, what do you think kids see themselves doing? And what do you think the kids say? They see themselves standing or sitting? Sitting. And see themselves talking or writing? Exactly. And so when we say that word to the kids, that's what this feeling conjures up. So we have an interesting little situation on our hands. That tests, as we have just defined them, are sometimes the least effective way of finding out what kids can do in a foreign language. They are demotivators for the vast majority of our students, partially because they stimulate tons of anxiety. Now, we've been talking about how important it is to keep kids motivated in the process of learning, but tests end up being one of those devices that can stifle that motivation. Anxiety, I was going to have you talk about this, but we're going to run short on time, so I'm going to talk about it for you. Anxiety matters so much. Think about what Krashen said about anxiety and the affective filter. And just think common sense. If you're anxious and nervous about something, like I am right now, if you're anxious and nervous, sometimes you can't do your best job. But actually the anxiety I'm experiencing right now is the good anxiety. I'm prepared. I know where I want to go. I've got anxiety that's keeping me on my toes. I'm talking about debilitating anxiety. That's the anxiety that our students often feel on tests. So it's really ironic, I think, that the tool that is probably the least effective at finding out what kids can do in a foreign language is actually the tool that is used the most. Some of us like to get rid of the T word, and we use the A word. So we talk about assessment. And so we think that this is going to convey a different sort of feeling to our kids. Well, so before I came up here this week, I went upstairs to our little library upstairs, and I pulled out the Oxford English Dictionary and looked to see what it said about assessment. And these are the words that it came up with: evaluation, estimation, and my favorite, an estimate of worth. So these are words that are associated with assessment. So a little story. Many of you know about the TEL project, and you know about its association with STARTALK and the inspiration for the Stella modules, but the TEL project is the Teacher Effectiveness for Language Learning project, which has through a lot of research and collaborative research from others, has defined those things that effective language teachers do. And one of the 7 domains of the TEL framework has to do with finding out what learners can do, and we called it assessment in the beginning, because assessment is an umbrella term that includes a lot of different ways of assessing. But then, in a major revision of TEL, a year and a half ago, the TEL developers thought about this, and they said, hey, do we think testing isn't one of the appropriate ways of measuring what students can do? And the answer among that group was no. Well, when we say assessment, testing isn't part of the umbrella of assessment. So what did TEL do? They changed it to performance and feedback. So that domain is no longer called assessment, but it's very clear in your face that we should be looking for ways for students to perform, and the next part of that is to give them feedback. So we have a dilemma on our hands. We've got words that are often used this day, particularly on a Friday in schools. These 2 words are coming up a lot in a lot of schools in the land. And they are conjuring up all those feelings that you talked about this morning. But the dilemma is that we have a need to assess, right? You would agree with that? We have that need. So the challenge is, can we state the meaning and purpose of assessment in a way that might feel more helpful to students? And I'm going to answer that question for you by offering this possible phrase to substitute. Instead of assessment, instead of testing, calling it checking for learning. Now, I've tried this out with a number of people over the past 2 or 3 weeks, and everybody says, oh, that feels so much better. It feels less threatening. It almost feels like it's there to help me as a learner. And so I think I would suggest to you that it's one way that we can be non-judgmental. It gives opportunity for kids to demonstrate what they can do. It can be more about the work than about the learner, and it's about how we measure the work against the target, the goal of what we want the work to actually be. I think I'm proposing to you that checking for learning can be a new mindset for us. So when we think about assessment being for the purpose of helping learners learn better, then it can actually liberate me from some of the old paradigms of assessing and can help propel me to recognize those tools that I might have been using that are really not effective, that really may be psychologically damaging to my students, and opt for more tools that would be uplifting and forward-thinking for our students. So I think this might be the last thing I'm going to ask you to do at your tables, but I have to ask you to do this. I want to ask you to think about this question. Who needs to know how much learning is going on? Who are the people who need to know? And when you answer that question, I want you to rank order who needs to know first, second, third, fourth, whatever. All right, here you go. Thank you, thank you. So I'm going to channel you right now. And I think that I know what you said. So in my channeling you, I think that you said the first person who needs to know about how well they're doing or how much learning is happening is the student. And that the next person you said is probably the teacher. And the third group of people is everybody else. Because when we talk about the motivated learner, the empowered learner, the kid whose batteries are charged and he's ready to learn, then he needs people to help him achieve his goals. So I, as the teacher, become his coach and his facilitator. There are two basic ways that we check for learning. In our research and in our practice, we know this. Two basic ways that we check for learning. And the research calls it formatively and summatively. And in STARTALK programs, we actually do both. We use formative checks for learning while learning is happening, and we use summative checks for learning that at the end of learning experiences. So let's dig into that just a little bit as we have just a few more minutes this morning. Our informative checks for learning, these are teacher-centered opportunities that are embedded into each and every lesson that we teach. They give the learner and the teacher information about what learning happened, how much learning happened, how well it happened, and really importantly, what needs to happen next as a result of this learning experience. They position, formative checks for learning, position the learner to be in charge of his own learning, hence his need to be the first to know what's going on in that regard. And then they position the teacher as the coach or facilitator. Summative checks for learning are a little bit different than that. They are intended to be almost like celebration opportunities for students. They're more cumulative in nature. They might combine skills so that students feel that they can put things together in a cohesive set. So they might be like end-of-unit checks. In STARTALK, we have a number of model curricula that are at the STARTALK website, and I just pulled one of them the other day, Oh, the Places You'll Visit, and it's Travel Camp Abroad. And at the end of this very nicely created unit, there is a summative assessment similar to an integrated performance assessment, an IPA, in that the student first encounters an interpretive task. He then takes information from that interpretive task and he engages in an interpersonal task with some of his peers. And finally, they engage in a presentational task. So this is an example of a summative type of assessment. So there would have been many formative checks for learning along the way to get kids ready for this. Another summative check that we would frequently see in STARTALK student programs are projects. I see that many of our students engage in projects throughout the course of their program, and then also, particularly for projects or for programs that involve elementary school children or middle school children, we have set programs at the end of the sessions to be able to show the parents what the learners can do. Now, in STARTALK programs, so we do both. We do summative and we do formative checks for learning. But we really are in a position to favor one more than another in terms of checking for learning. So in STARTALK programs, since we don't have to give tests and we don't have to give grades, and since we already have motivated learners and we have learners who want to learn, STARTALK is positioned wonderfully to be married to formative checks for learning. Because we've got the combination that is perfect for formative checks for people who want to learn. And therefore, for that, they're already empowered and motivated. For them to remain empowered and motivated, they have to know how well they're doing and what they need to do next. Formative checks for learning are an enormous way for us to find out how well learning is happening as it's happening, which means we have the opportunity to repair and redirect in the moment of learning. And the research actually suggests that checking for learning in formative ways is one of the most powerful ways to improve achievement of learning in general. The empowered learner, as we've already said, has to have feedback often, and actually he should have feedback on his learning every day. We have further research that says there's a direct correlation in the amount and frequency of formative checks for learning and achievement. So the more checks for learning, the better the achievement. And a very interesting fact is that struggling learners are direct beneficiaries of formative checks for learning because oftentimes they are reluctant to say, I don't understand, I don't know how. And the teacher's systematic use of formative checks for learning ensures that these folks do not fall off the radar screen. We've already talked about the fact that the formative checks for learning help position the student to be his own agent. He can be his own advocate for learning. They give feedback for teachers so that teachers know how I can improve the work that we're doing and how well we are meeting the learning targets we're setting for each of the lessons. And they help teachers modify their practice in the moment and for tomorrow. Thompson and William put it in a nutshell when they said that formative checks for learning are defined this way: students and teachers using evidence to adapt teaching and learning to meet individual needs minute by minute and day by day. It's a wonderful way of thinking about how frequently and to what degree we need to be checking for learning. So all of that this morning that I've been going on now for probably 35 minutes is context for the fact that STARTALK has a new product that is going to be made available to you soon, but we don't know exactly when, but not too far away. And this product is called Checking for Learning in STARTALK Student Programs. So this product is going to be available to you, we hope and we think, in two different ways. First, as a web-based set of materials, and also as a downloadable, printable document that would have easy access for the user, even in print, to be able to access documents that are actually online. In order for this to be helpful to leaders and teachers of STARTALK student programs, this product answers 8 essential questions. And here they are. What do we mean by checking for learning? What does that term mean, checking for learning? How do I know what to check? How do I use formative and summative, when do I use, my titles are so small here I can't read them. When do I use summative and formative checks for learning? How do I use formative checks for learning? Since this is really the focus, how do I actually use those? How can students check for learning? How can I as a teacher give effective feedback to my students? How can I report progress of learning in meaningful ways? And how can external assessment help in checking for learning? So throughout this product, you'll find that there's background research to support understanding of those essential questions. There are references and sources for further reading. There are links to source documents and materials. There are activities and strategies, and there are additional video and print resources to support checking for learning. So our hope is that these materials will provide teachers with valuable and useful information to facilitate checks for learning and to provide meaningful feedback to students. And the second thing we hope is that they will fan the fire of motivation in our students and propel them on lifelong journeys of language learning. I'm going to call on someone other than me to sum up what we've been talking about this morning, and this person is one of my heroes. Some of you may recognize her. Her name is Susan Brookhart. She's an author for ASCD and Solution Tree. Some of you may have heard her speak. She's a wonderful, plain-speaking person, and one of her specialties is assessment, which we now know as checking for learning. But Sue says everything I've been trying to say better and shorter. And I wanted you to hear what she has to say as a wrap-up.
Hi, my name is Sue Brookhart. I'm an author and professional developer. My areas are grading and formative assessment. This little video is my manifesto. I'm going to tell you what I believe to be true about assessment and why I believe it. First, I believe that in a perfect world there would be no grades, that students would learn because they had evidence that they were learning important things that they wanted to know and would be useful to them. Second, I believe that short of that perfect world, the very best thing we can do for students is to give them a picture of the learning target they're trying to hit and help them get there by giving them short and long-term evidence of where they're going, how they're getting there, what they need to do next. It's really more important what the student knows about their performance and their achievement than what you, the teacher, know about their performance and achievement, although I know sometimes it doesn't feel that way. The learning is the important thing, not the assessing. The assessing is a tool to help with the learning. Done well, students really want to know where they are. Have you ever watched a student play a video game? They pay attention to their points, to how their little men or little cars are moving. They're seeking feedback all the time to make their performance better. People want to make their performance better. And that's the function of assessment, is to hold up that mirror to what you're doing and show you what it looks like and where to go next. And that's the function of what I do, I think, is to help teachers see how to use assessment practices and grading practices to help students do that.
Thank you, Sue, and thank you this morning.